Hello, my friends. Welcome. A few months ago, I don't remember what I was talking about, but I brought up the subject of the writer, the author of Don Quixote, Cervantes. I don't know how it came up in the conversation. And I remarked on the fact that many years ago, 50 years ago, in my 20s, I had read an article by one of the major Russian writers, and I didn't remember the writer, and I hardly remember anything about the article, but I do remember that he was comparing the character of Hamlet by Shakespeare with Don Quixote. And I said, I don't remember who it was. I've been trying to find it. Sure enough, in the comments, many of you told me who the author was, the writer, and that was Turgenev. Don't know whether I'm pronouncing his name properly. Turgenev or Turgenev, I'm not sure. But in any case, sure. And I have found it, and I have been thinking about that. And about 2 days ago, one of you said, could you do something on Don Quixote and chivalry and things like that, you being Spanish and so on. And so I thought, okay, this is a good opportunity to do this. I found the article and I have been reading it very carefully. So I am going to share it with you. It's an excellent article. It starts at the beginning with a little bit of academic. It sounds a little bit too academic. I beg you to stay because he don't go away, because he gets into the personality of the characters, and it's very interesting. The first thing to say, however, since we're going to talk about these great geniuses that were Shakespeare and Cervantes, I don't want you to get the impression that that Turgenev is going to put them in sort of contradiction to each other, that he's going to say which book is better or who writes better or who is, it's nothing at all like that, okay? He acknowledges that Shakespeare is Shakespeare and practically a demagogue, and that's absolutely fine. He's just using the characters that these two authors have created, which are so opposite to one another, to tell us how both writers were trying to tell us something about the human condition. They extrapolated the characters to a sort of an extreme sort of thing. So they are in poles opposite to one another. One perhaps leading to utter tragedy, and the other one ending up in the comedy. Yeah, none of us is 100% Hamlet and 100% Don Quixote, but we all have a little bit of both. Some of us more than one, the others more than the other. And so he's going to delve into the characters, right? Now, I have to tell you a little bit. Let me introduce, just for 2 or 3 minutes, Cervantes. I know you know about Shakespeare, so you might not know as much as about Cervantes. A very different person. My goodness, a very different life. Cervantes was actually a slave for 5 years. When he came back home to Spain, he was imprisoned, so he stayed another 7 in jail. He said, a very humble man. He had learned a lot from those experiences. He said that in jail he learned a very important virtue that he had never had before, the virtue of patience. Very different person, yes, very different, a very different life from that of Shakespeare, a playwright respected and honored and so on. Cervantes, at the age of 24, joined the forces at Lepanto. Lepanto, you remember, is the Ottoman Empire, the Turks trying to come into Europe with Islam. Okay. Now, Spaniards had fought Islam in the south, for 800 years. That was over. It finished in 1492. So now 100 years later, Islam is coming to Europe from the east. There they go again. All right. So Cervantes joined, and voluntarily, the great captain, the leader, was John of Austria. We call it Austria because that is the name we gave in Spain to the Habsburg, the Holy Roman Germanic Empire at the time. He was actually the illegitimate son of the Emperor Charles V, or Charles I of Spain. So he was a half-brother to Philip II, him of, yes, you know that, of the Armada. Okay, so, but he was a very great captain, won the war and so on. Okay, so Cervantes, after about 4 years or 5 years in the war, decides that, okay, he wants to go home now. He gets some letters of recommendation. Oh, he had been hit and injured in battle. And so he lost the movement of his left hand. Something, I suppose, to do with the nerve or something, but he got hit, and he could no longer use his left hand. All right, so, but he hoped that with his letters of recommendation from the great captain, he would be able to perhaps, have a career in the army, in the country. So he takes these letters with him, tries to go back to Spain, and he is taken by the it was the trade of piracy at that moment. Yes, at that time. It was the Berbers of North Africa, the Turks, and so on. They would get Christians, enslave them, they would become slaves. And it was really a trade. It was a business in that they would release them if enough money was paid. Okay, now most of them wouldn't have anybody, would be in circumstances where no one could pay for them. Many of them, probably their parents or whoever, didn't even know that they were there. So they became officially slaves of the Arabs and Muslims and the Turks, anyway. Okay, some of them, if they were important people, the price would go up, and they would allow for money to be paid to them, and then they would be rescued. Cervantes and his brother were captured. If you were important enough, then you were considered a captive. If you were not important, then you were an outright slave. His brother Rodrigo was an ordinary slave, but they they thought that they could get about 30 gold sovereign escudos. We call them the sovereign. Let's say sovereign, okay? Gold sovereigns for him. Cervantes, on the other hand, Michael, he had these letters with him, these recommendation letters signed by the great leader. So my goodness, the price went up, and the price went up to 500 golden sovereigns. I have been looking at it, and it would have been more or less in today's terms, very generally about $250,000 or $500,000, something along those lines. It was impossible. No one was going to pay that for him. So he knew that, and he tried to escape 4 times, and he was well, all kinds of things. Anyway, at the end, he's rescued by a fraternity, a Catholic religious fraternity. I think it was the Trinitarians, who would collect money and then take them and pay their ransom, and they would be freed. All right, so he is eventually freed. When he was in slavery, he heard that he was, he didn't know the language, but with time he learned it a little bit, and he knew that his masters would refer to him as something that sounded to him like Saavedra, something like that. He didn't know what it meant, but and I wouldn't be pronouncing it correctly, but it sounded something like that. And eventually he knew that meant in their language cripple, the cripple, because of his hand. Yeah. So that is a surname that he will use later as a pen name, because his second surname was not Saavedra. His mother's surname was something else. So that is where he comes from. So we know him as Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. Okay, so he came back home. He didn't have the letters, and by that time the great Capitan had died. So there was no way that he could get another one. He has to find a job somehow. By that time his father was dead, and he had to take care of his mother and also of his sister. I'm not sure at this moment whether it was his sister or his sister-in-law. Anyway, but his sister and the kids, it was his responsibility. Yeah. He gets a job as a sort of a tax collector of some kind. I suppose in those days being a tax collector meant knocking on your door and asking for the cash or something like that. Collecting monies, anyway. And he does that, and he gets inspected once, and the books don't add up. As you can see, while we continue talking about him and the article that Turgenev wrote, you will see that a person like him, you would recognize this person, could not be a common thief. Probably what happened was that, you know how sometimes if you are against the ropes and you have children to feed or something, you might say, well, I'll borrow. You have this bag of cash, and the temptation might come to say, well, I'll borrow some, and of course I'll return it. I'll put it back, but perhaps. Anyway, he got into trouble. The books didn't add up, and he was sent to jail. And there he was for a number of years. And that is where he wrote Don Quixote. Let me go to the article, and if I have something to say, I will say it as I'm reading it. So this essay is not an essay, actually. It's a speech given by Turgenev. It's a speech delivered on the 10th of January 1860 at a public reading for the benefit of the Society for the Aid of Indigent Writers and Scientists. Okay, so it's to help them. And let's see. As I said, bear with me for the first 2 minutes, because it's a little bit academic at first, but you will get into it, okay? The first edition of Shakespeare's tragedy, Hamlet, and the first part of Cervantes' novel, Don Quixote, appeared in the same year, at the very beginning of the 17th century. By the way, they both died on the same day, in the same year, too. This concurrence seems momentous. The proximity of time in this instance induces a consideration of a whole series of events. He who would comprehend a poet, Goethe maintained, must enter that poet's environment. And though one who is not a poet himself has no right to demand, he can nevertheless hope that his audience will accompany him on his wanderings, will share his tour of exploration. Some of my views may perchance be puzzling in their uniqueness, but the poetic masterpieces created by the genius of superior minds and endowed with an eternal vitality have this peculiarity as well, that one's conceptions of them, as of life in general, may differ greatly from one another's, may even be diametrically opposed, yet at the same time be valid. Much comment on Hamlet has already come forth, and much more is still to come. What varied conclusions have already been reached by the numerous scholars who have scrutinized this character as unfathomable as an unplumbed well. What vary his exclamation mark. How many, yeah? Don Quixote, on the other hand, because of the idiosyncrasy of its purpose and the truly admirable lucidity of a narrative that seems permeated by the southern sun, does not permit of such a diversity of critical reaction. It is unfortunate, however, that our conception of Don Quixote should be equivocal. Only too often we substitute the name of Don Quixote for a jester. The term Quixotic or Quixotism carries the connotation of idealistic twaddle, whereas in reality one ought to discern Quixotism as an archetype of self-sacrifice. Even though Don Quixote himself has been portrayed, in the book as a ludicrous figure, and there is a reason for this. As we have already noted, the simultaneous appearance of the two masterpieces gives cause for reflection. In these two types, it seems to me, are embodied two contrasting basic tendencies, the two poles of the human axis, about which they revolve. All men, to my mind, conform to one type or the other, one to that of Hamlet, another to that of Don Quixote. Though it is true, no doubt, that in our era the Hamlets are far more common. Still, the Don Quixotes are by no means hard to find. Let me illustrate. All men live, consciously or otherwise, by virtue of certain principles, certain ideals. In a word, by virtue of what they deem true, beautiful, good, and so on. Many take their ideals intact from specific, historically sanctioned institutions. They thrive by conforming their lives to the vision it offers. Life. Sometimes driven by passion or contingency, such a man may stray, but he neither ponders nor doubts. Others, on the contrary, examine such deals, sound their very depth. However that may be, I can hardly go wrong in declaring that with people in general, the basic ideal, the groundwork of life, is to be found either within ourselves or in some external object. In other words, for each one of us, either his own ego is of cardinal importance, or something else ranks higher than ego. In rebuttal, I may be told that in actuality there is no such trenchant demarcation between one's own I and the adjacent something which he honors still more, that a person may harbor both ends, heeding now to this and now the other, that they may even shade into one another. But then I did not wish to suggest that variation and contradiction are not perfectly possible in human nature. I simply intended to indicate the two polar attitudes of man toward the ideal. I shall now attempt to set forth how, as I see it, the two attitudes are intrinsic to the two types I have mentioned. We will start with Don Quixote. What does Don Quixote symbolize? Let us not be hasty in examining him. We must be aware of superficialities. Let us not see in Don Quixote merely the figure of the knight designed to satirize the tales of medieval chivalry. It is now generally recognized that the significance of this individuality has been amended by the author himself. In the second part of Cervantes' work, Don Quixote is no longer the same character as in the first, no longer the comical and ridiculed buffoon, hounded by unstinting blows. He has become the delightful peer of dukes and duchesses, the erudite mentor of the governor's bodyguard. Let me stop here because I need to tell you there was a second book too, and that is because when the book was published, it became so famous, it became so popular that other people who tried to write, the sequels to that, the further adventures of Don Quixote, Don Quixote 2, Don Quixote 3, and Cervantes had a great deal of love and respect for the character that he created. So he decided 10 years later to write a book too, where he would have Don Quixote died at the end of the book, so that no one else would think of any more adventures for Don Quixote. Okay, and this is what Turgenev is referring to here. So, let us therefore seek the core of the matter. To repeat, what does Don Quixote typify? Faith, first of all. A belief in something eternal, indestructible, in a truth that is beyond the comprehension of the individual human being, which is to be achieved only through the medium of self-abnegation and undeviating worship. Don Quixote is entirely permeated by an attachment to his ideal, for which he is ready to endure untold misery, even to sacrifice his own life if need be. His own life he esteems only insofar as it can serve his ideal, which is to institute justice and truth on earth. He's going around trying to institute justice and truth on earth. That is why, ladies and gentlemen, when you laugh at his adventures, at his windmills and all the rest of it, after you finish laughing, which is the first, then you don't want to laugh anymore. You actually feel a little bit guilty at having laughed at him. You feel a little bit uncomfortable. It's not a comic. You realize that immediately, because you understand in your gut that what he's pursuing is not worthy of laughter. You see? So, let me continue. It may be said that his deranged imagination, he is a little bit of a nutter, right? It may be said that his deranged imagination draws upon the fantastic world of chivalric romance for his concept. Granted that this constitutes the comic side of Don Quixote, but his ideal itself remains undefiled and intact. To live for oneself, to be concerned with one's own ego, this Don Quixote would regard it as a disgrace. He exists, if one may put it so, he exists outside himself. He lives for others, for his brethren, in the hope of neutralizing evil and to outwitting evil itself. He's there to unwit those sinister figures, sorcerers, giants, windmills, whatever, whom he regards evil as the enemy of mankind. There is no vestige of egotism in him. His own self concerns him least of all. He completely personifies self-sacrifice. And please note what this term implies. He does not probe or question. He believes, forever undismayed. Hence he is undaunted, uncomplaining, satisfied with meager rations of and happy garments. I think there is a typo here. I'm sorry. What cares he for exuberance? It never even enters his mind. Serene at heart, he is in itself, in spirit, superior and valiant. His touching piety does not curb his liberty. Though not arrogant, not at all, he does not distrust himself, nor his vocation, nor even his physical capacity, such as it was. His will is a will of iron and unswerving. The continuous striving towards one and the same goal has fixed the unvarying tenor of his thoughts. His intellect takes on a one-sided uniformity. Hardly a scholar, he regards knowledge as superfluous. What would it avail him to know everything? But, ladies and gentlemen, one thing he knows, the main thing. He is aware of the why and wherefore of his existence. And this, I put to you, is the cornerstone of all erudition. Don Quixote may at times resemble a total maniac, since he often overlooks the plainest objects when they are directly in front of his eyes. The most obvious things, unmistakable to anyone, vanished before his eyes, melting like wax in the fire of his nightly fervor. He actually sees living Moors in wooden puppets and a host of knights in a drove of rams. At other times, he shows the limits of his mental scope by appearing incapable of sharing in even trifling amusement. Incapable he is of easy participation. He is like an ancient, firmly anchored tree, its roots thrust into the deep layers of the soil from which it is unable to move. In his inability to alter his convictions or to shift from one subject to another. The massiveness of Don Quixote's moral structure. It must not be forgotten that this distracted knight-errant is the most moral creature on earth. The massive of Don Quixote's moral structure imparts a particular gravity and stateliness to whatever he may say or do. In a word, his ethical character gives an uprightness to his whole figure, despite the preposterous situations and the humiliations into which he is incessantly tumbling. Don Quixote is an enthusiast, radiant with his devotion to an idea. Now, what then does Hamlet represent? Above all, analysis, scrutiny, egotism, and consequently disbelief. He lives wholly for himself, and even an egotist cannot muster faith in himself alone. One believes only in that which is outside or above oneself. But Hamlet's eye, in which he has no faith, is still precious to him. This is the ultimate position to which he invariably reverts, because his soul does not spy in the world beyond itself anything to which it can adhere. He is a skeptic, yet always he is in a stir about himself. He is forever agitated. Regard not to his duty, to the state of his own inward affairs. Doubting everything, Hamlet pitilessly includes his own self in those doubts. He is too thoughtful, too fair-minded to be contented with what he finds within himself. Self-conscious, aware of his own weakness, he knows how restricted his powers are, but his self-consciousness itself is a force. Emanating from it is the irony that is precisely the antithesis of Don Quixote's enthusiasm. Hamlet inweighs against himself readily, magnifies his own shortcomings, spies upon himself, is mindful of his minutest defects, despises himself, and at the same time apparently he thrives on this disdain. He distrusts himself and yet is deeply solicitous about himself, does not know what he is after, nor why he lives at all, and still firmly adheres to life. In the second scene of the first act, he exclaims, "Oh, that these two solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his canon 'gainst self-slaughter. O God, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seems to me all the uses of this world." But he will not surrender this flat and unprofitable life. He has brooded over suicide long before his father's ghost appears, which the gruesome message that yields a crushing blow to his already emasculated will, yet venture on self-murder he does not. His attachment to life is indicated in this very meditation on ending it. What 18-year-old is not acquainted with some such feelings? When the blood burns, how prodigal the soul. When the blood burns, how prodigal the soul. Let us not be too exacting with Hamlet. He suffers, and his suffering is more valetudinary, excruciating, all-encompassing, and intense than that of Don Quixote. Don Quixote receives blows from everybody else, but he's fine. Don Quixote is belabored, it says here, roughed up, by rough shepherds and by convicts whom he himself has set free. In the book, Cervantes actually explains when he goes about how people are beaten up. He's always talking about his experiences, how people that he has trusted when he was going to escape later betrayed him. Things like his own personal experiences as a slave are very much in the book. And when you know that and you see in the book someone beating, he explains it in great detail. Anyway, so he is roughed up, yes, by shepherds and by convicts whom he himself has set free. Hamlet's wounds, on the other hand, are self-inflicted. The blade with which he vexes and torments himself is the double-edged sword of analysis. Don Quixote, it must be acknowledged, really is ridiculous. His is the most comical likeness that any poet ever depicted. That his name has passed into the language as a scornful nickname, even among our own Russian peasantry. We know that. Our own ears bear witness to that. One merely has to allude to his name to evoke an emaciated figure, hunched, gaunt, in tattered attire, weirdly patched, on a half-starved horse, mare, always loyal, though, even though starving. A creature evoking pity tinged with ridicule, yeah? Yes, Don Quixote is inconsistent. But our laughter tends somehow towards reconcilement, to then absolution, to fortitude. And if the maxim, what you laugh at now you may one day venerate, as we say in Russian, if that be true, then we might very well add, whomever you scoff at, you might very well end up forgiving, even loving. Not so with Hamlet. His appearance is attractive. His melancholy, his pale countenance, though in truth he is not gaunt but portly, as his mother observes, he's fat. His black velvet garb, the feather in his hat, his courtly manners, the poetic turn of his speech, the constant sense of superiority to others, together with his caustic mockery of his own self. All of these fascinate us, attracts us. Everybody wishes to be regarded as Hamlet. Nobody wishes to be a Don Quixote. No one would ever consider sneering at Hamlet. And therein is his sentence. You see, it is all but impossible to love him. Only those of Horatius' caliber can attach themselves to Hamlet. I shall return to this point later. All will sympathize with him, it is evident, since nearly all identified in him, that is Horatius, characteristics of their own. Horatius, of Hamlet, yes. But to love him, I reiterate, is impossible, because he himself cannot love anyone. Let us expand our comparison. Hamlet is the son of a king whom a brother has assassinated in order to usurp his throne. Hamlet's father emerges from the grave, from sulphurous and tormenting flames, to enjoin Hamlet to avenge the fratricide. But the son vacillates, equivocates, consoles himself with self-reproach, and although he eventually kills his stepfather, he does so only incidentally. And here is a deep psychological ambiguity for which even profound critics have had the audacity to rebuke Shakespeare. But Don Quixote, a poor man without social connections, old and solitary, attempts single-handed to uproot all evil and to deliver the persecuted throughout the world, whoever they may be. He's a madman. And what if his first endeavor to deliver innocence from tyranny produces only redoubled misery for that innocence? Yeah, I know what he's talking. Yes, there is this passage where there they both go, riding, Don Quixote and his squire, his footman, Sancho. And they hear the cry of a child. A child is crying in the distance. So off they go because he has to save the child. And what he finds is that the child's master is beating him into a pulp. And of course he has this stop right there, he talks like this. And, And the master, who's this guy there on that horse? I mean, what is, who are you? I swear by this and that unless you stop right now. Okay, he says, I'll stop. Give me your word of honor that you will never hit this child again. Okay, I'll give you my word of honor. Good, I believe you. And he turns back and off he goes. And then the master looks at the boy and starts beating him again double. And it's a complicated scene. So this is what Turgenev is referring to here. It says, and what if his first endeavor to deliver innocence from tyranny produces only redoubled misery for that innocence? I refer to the scene where Don Quixote rescues an apprentice from a pummeling by his master. Where the liberator withdraws, the enraged artisan inflicts a tenfold punishment on the boy. Yeah. Neither does it matter that in assaulting the windmills, believing them to be menacing giants, he is also demolishing useful objects. The comic vein on these episodes must not divert our attention from the intrinsic meaning latent within them. Since when has it been ordained that he who is about to sacrifice himself should first of all weigh and measure each of the probable consequences that his act may bring about? Really, when you're going to sacrifice, you say, well, okay. One so attentive to the details would be incapable of that sacrifice. Such an experience could never befall a Hamlet. Armed with his astute, all-comprehending mind, he commits no such crude blunders. Oh no. He would never crusade against windmills. And were there giants in actuality, he would likewise stay away from them. It would never occur to Hamlet to hold out a barbarous basing while he strove to convince everyone that it was in truth the magic helmet of membrane. I presume even that if truth incarnate were to arise before Hamlet, he would remain skeptical of its authenticity. Who knows but that he would challenge it, saying perhaps that there is no truth, just as there are no giants. We laugh at Don Quixote. But, my dear sirs, who of us can positively affirm with certainty that he will always and under all circumstances know the difference between a brass wash basin and an enchanted golden helmet? Let everyone consciously examine his convictions, past and present, and let him then determine how far he may be certain of knowing one from the other. For the real importance, it seems to me, lies in the persistence of the conviction itself, and as for the outcome, that is in the hands of fate. It alone can reveal whether we have waged war against spectres of real enemies, just as it does the effectiveness of our weapons. Our purpose is to arm ourselves and fight. Noteworthy also is the relation of the mob and the masses of the so-called human race to how the human race, how the mob reacts both to Hamlet and Don Quixote. In Hamlet, the human race, the mob, if you like, it is represented by Polonius. And in Don Quixote, it is Sancho Panza who represent this mass. Polonius is an active, practical, worldly-wise old man, although he is also bigoted and garrulous. He's a good administrator and a model father. This can be noted in the manner in which he admonishes his son Laertes, preparing him to his going abroad. Polonius considers Hamlet not a monomaniac so much as a reckless child. If Hamlet were not the son of a king, Polonius would have sneered at his frivolity and his ineptness in carrying out his ideas. Take, for instance, the characteristic scene between Hamlet and Polonius in the third act. Hamlet, in turn, is inclined to sneer at the old man. And this incident substantiates this our conjecture. Permit me to quote it to you. This interaction, Polonius and Hamlet. Yes, my lord, the queen would speak with you, and presently. Do you see yonder cloud as almost in shape of a camel? By the mass, and 'tis like a camel indeed. Methinks it is like a weasel. Ooh, it is back like a weasel. Or like a whale. Yeah, very like a whale. Then I will come to my mother by and by. Is it not apparent from this scene that Polonius is both a courtier who is obliged to please the prince and an adult who would not oppose the whims of a deranged and fickle boy? Polonius does not in the least take Hamlet for granted, and in this he is right. Since he lacks insight, he of course errs when he attributes Hamlet's unreasonable notions to being in love with Ophelia. But in other respects, he fathoms Hamlet's nature quite correctly. The Hamlets, on the whole, are really nugatory people, nugatory to the people. They impart nothing. They can lead nowhere, for they themselves are stray. How can one, uncertain of his own ground, guide others? Besides, the Hamlets loathe the populace. When one does not respect himself, how can he revere anyone else? Of what value are the masses to such an individual? Is any bother about them worth the effort? Furthermore, Hamlet is an aristocrat, not only by right of birth, but also by reason of his nature. Now, Sancho Panza, however, is another sort. His feet are firmly on the ground. He knows, he laughs at Don Quixote, realizing that the latter is a madman. Still, on three consecutive occasions, he forsakes his home and his wife and daughter to accompany the lunatic, to endure all manner of privations, and yet to remain devoted unto death. It's a very moving scene at the end of the book. You will see it at the end of the article when Don Quixote dies and Sancho's reaction. Sancho knows that his master, His Excellency Sir, is mad. Why does he accompany him? He has faith in Don Quixote. He's actually quite proud of him. And during his master's last moments, he kneels by his bedside, weeping with emotion. This devotion and zeal cannot be accounted for by Sancho Panza's having expected any sort of remuneration. He knows he's not going to get it. Being governor of that island, he wanted to be the governor. If we ever get rich, Your Excellency, I would ask that you made me the governor of this island. His main thing, he was a swine herder, right? And he just finds that the most beautiful thing in the world would be to boss people around. You are the governor of this island, and you can say, go here, you go there, bring me this, bring me that. You remember the Fiddler on the Roof when he sings, if I were a rich man, I would build this staircase going up and another one coming down and another one leading nowhere just for show. Yeah, well, this is kind of Sancho Panza. He would love to be the governor of something, just people would bow at you. Can you imagine? People bowing? Oh my, okay. But he knows that it's not going to happen. But in any case, he accompanies him, he goes with him. He knows that he's not going to get much in sort of remuneration. He has too much common sense to be deluded. He knows perfectly well that aside from discomfort and an occasional drubbing, there will be no tangible compensation. One has to probe deeper for the source of his attachment. The cause lies in the preeminent tendency of the masses to follow blindly and wholeheartedly, though unfortunately they are also conversant with negative emotional factors. It comes from their capacity for enthusiasm, from that ignoring of personal benefits which a poor man tosses out as he does his crust of bread. If you can offer him some vision, some hope, they'll follow you. They have nothing else. And that is why it's a terrible thing to abuse that. The trust of the poor. It's like robbing a child of his innocence. This is the universal and historic behavior of the masses. They generally conclude by following in complete faith those whom they might have originally even despised. But they know they might have even pelted them with stones. They might have tormented them previously, and yet somehow they know and they follow them afterwards. The vanguard, however, undaunted by neither reaction, are driven onward undeviatingly like Don Quixote by their inward vision, fixed upon the nebulous distance, now rising, now falling, this is the prophet, until the goal is at last attained. And indeed, only he who is impelled by the dictates of the heart arrives at his destination. Vauvenac, in French, he said, "Les grandes pensées viennent du cœur." Great thoughts come from the heart. Or the great, thoughts, thinkers. But the Hamlets find nothing, invent nothing, and leave no trace but the vestiges of their own personality, no sign of any lasting influence. They do not love or believe, ergo, what can they find? Even in chemistry, not to speak of organic nature, two ingredients must combine in order to produce a third. But the Hamlets are forever alone, apprehensive about themselves, and therefore sterile. One may interpolate, what of Ophelia? Doesn't Hamlet love her? Let me touch on this, and incidentally on Don Quixote's Dulcinea as well. Dulcinea is the beautiful lady. She's actually an ugly, fat, ill-smelling peasant, but he decided in his imagination that anyway. Okay, so let me touch on this, and incidentally on Don Quixote's Dulcinea as well. The attitudes of these two types towards women are also significant. Don Quixote loves an imaginary, non-existent Dulcinea and is ready to give his life for her. Recall the words which he spoke to his conqueror while the latter stood over him with his unsheathed sword. Yes, at one point they're battling, and the conqueror, the other knight, has him on the floor with the point of his sword here. Okay, he's going to kill him. And what does he say? He said, "Stab me, Sir Knight, but let not my languor detract from the fame and glory of my Dulcinea. I still maintain that she is the perfection of beauty on earth." He had fallen, you see, but he didn't want that failure to stain her beauty and virginity. That is what he was thinking about, her. Don Quixote loves ideally, chastely, so ideally that he does not discover that the object of his passion does not exist. So chastely that when his Dulcinea appears before him in the guise of a coarse and filthy peasant woman, he doubts his own eyesight and supposes that she had been transformed by evil sorcerers. During my Turgenev continues, during my life's wanderings, I too have encountered individuals who gave up their lives for non-existent Dulcineas. Don Quixote is not the only one, but Dulcineas can be a woman, or it can be something else. I too have encountered individuals who gave up their lives for non-existent Dulcineas, or for some other crude, other loathsome object that became for them the incarnation of their ideal. And those whose metamorphosis they likewise ascribed to evil contingencies, sorceries, well, perhaps not, but something else. There is always another reason. Evil contingencies, circumstances, other people. I nearly said evil forces. I have witnessed this. And when those types shall have vanished from the world, then let the book of history be closed. There will remain in it nothing worth reading. That is how we all are. There is no wantonness whatsoever in Don Quixote. All his thoughts are modest and innocent. And deep in his heart, there is, in fact, not much hope of his ever uniting with Dulcinea. Indeed, he fears such a meeting. As for Hamlet, can he actually love? Is it possible that his ironic creator, the most profound of all critics of the human soul, has indeed resolved to endow this egotistic, this skeptic, with the power to love? Him who has absorbed so much of the corrosive poison of self-analysis. Shakespeare did not contradict himself in this wise, and the curious reader can easily convince himself that this Hamlet, who is sensual and even sybaritic, enjoyer of luxuries, does not love, but merely pretends, and that too ineffectually. It is noteworthy that the courtier Rosencrantz smiles when Hamlet remarks that he is weary of women. Shakespeare himself testifies to this love trait. In the first scene of the third act, Hamlet declares to Ophelia, "I did love you once. Indeed, my lord, you made me believe so. You should not have believed me. I loved you not." And when Hamlet pronounces the last phrase, he is much nearer the truth than he can quite admit. His feelings for Ophelia, who is virtuous, even saintly, are either cynical. I note the dubious implication when in the mousetrap scene he begs to be allowed to lie in her lap, are either cynical or hyperbolic, as in the scene with her brother Laertes when Hamlet leaps into Ophelia's grave, asserting trite phrases 40,000 brothers could not, with all their quantity of love, make up my sum. Let them throw millions of acres on us. All his relations with Ophelia are for him only a form of being engrossed in himself. When he explains, "Nymph, in thy horizons be all my sins remembered," here again are echoed only the deep consciousness of his helplessness, of his own weakness, his incapacity to love. He is overwhelmed before her virtuous chastity. But let us dwell no longer on the shady aspect of the Hamlet type, which provoke discussion because they are so readily grasped. Let us acknowledge the positive element in him, the part that endures. In Hamlet is embodied the creed of negation, that same creed which another great poet has portrayed in the shape of Mephistopheles, depriving him of everything purely human. Hamlet is the counterpart of Mephistopheles, plus the living circle of human personality. Therefore, his doctrine of negation is not, like that of Mephistopheles, an evil force, but on the contrary, is aimed against evil. Hamlet's spirit of negation is skeptical of the good, but it is indubitably certain of the existence of evil and militates against it constantly. The good he mistrusts, somehow or other. He has misgivings about the genuineness of the truth it contains. And when he assails the good, it is because he surmises it to be camouflage, under whose guise evil and sham, his old enemies, are concealed. Hamlet does not laugh with that demoniacal, icy laughter of Mephistopheles. His bitter smile is permeated with a touching sorrow that betrays his agony, and this fact reconciles us to him. His skepticism has in it the strain of indifference, and hence his significance and merit. Good and evil, truth and falsehood, the beautiful and the repulsive, are not blended into one fortuitous, mute and blunt nondescript. Hamlet's skepticism is unceasingly at war with falsehood and lying.
Thus, while disbelieving the possibility of truth's realization now or ever, he becomes one of the chief vindicators of a truth which he himself does not fully accept. But in the spirit of negation, there is, just as there is in fire, a distractive force. And how can one confine this force within given limits, or say where it should halt, when what it destroys is so often inextricably from what one would preserve? That is where we frequently perceive the tragic side of human life. Wherever thinking precedes action, there is a divorce between thought and will, which tend more and more to be isolated from each other. And thus the native hue of a resolution is sicklied over the pale cast of thought, as Shakespeare says through Hamlet. And so, on the one hand, there are the Hamlets, meditative, scrupulous, often all-discerning, yet at the same time ineffective and condemned to inaction. And on the other hand, the half-frantic Don Quixotes, who aid and urge forward the human race solely because they behold and know only one thing, a thing as likely as not does not even exist in the form they imagine. A question reluctantly comes up: must one actually be demented to believe that there is such a thing as truth? Or is it possible that the mind loses all its force as soon as it is in control of itself? It would be useless digression to attempt to solve these problems even superficially. Suffice it to remark that in this dichotomy, in the above-mentioned dualism, we must recognize a law basic to all human life, that life consists in reality of perpetual reconciliation of two perpetually contending forces, two unremittingly opposites. If it were not for the risk of overwhelming my listeners with philosophical nomenclature, I would venture to say that the Hamlets are the expression of that tendency in the dynamics of nature for every living being to behave as though it were the center of creation, regarding all else as a thing made solely for its own sake. Thus, the midge that alighted on the forehead of Alexander the Great feasted on his blood with the complete self-assurance of a being entitled to do just that. And thus Hamlet, though he treats himself with disdain, an attitude beyond the scope of the midge, which has not evolved to a comparable degree of intelligence, though he treats himself with disdain, also sees himself as creation's center, and all else in the universe as converging on him. Without this tendency, without the force of egotism, the natural world could not function, any more than it could without that equally potent force, the innate tendency towards altruism, according to whose law all that matters is to exist entirely for others. This principle, this drive toward devotion and self-immolation, seeing in a comic light, is symbolized by the Don Quixotes of this earth. These two forces of immobility and motion, conservatism and progress, are the fundamental levers of all existing matter. They are implicit in the virgining of the meanest flower that grows. They are the key that will unlock the secrets of evolution and that give insight into the process whereby the most virile nations have evolved. But let us not dwell on such conjectures, which in any case are beyond the scope of our theme. As everyone knows, Hamlet is generally considered the most popular of Shakespeare's works. This tragedy belongs to those masterpieces that fill a theatre whenever they are performed. The phenomenon is understandable when we consider the current widespread tendency towards self-consciousness, meditation, self-doubt. But apart from the exquisiteness with which this work abounds, being perhaps the most striking product of the modern spirit, one cannot but wonder at the intellect of the author himself, to some extent the prototype of his own Hamlet, which, through the unbridled force of creative genius, gave this archetype for successive generations to study. The spirit that created this paragon is the spirit of a northern man, reflective and analytical, a brooding and bewildered spirit, lacking in either harmony or sudden exuberance, incapable of chiseled classical elegance, but producing a deeper effect through its very diversity and eccentricity. From the depths of his soul, he has wrestled the Hamlet type, and evinced by this very procedure that in the sphere of poetry, as in other aspects of human life, he towers above his species because he understands the species so thoroughly. Shakespeare does. The person of Don Quixote reflects the spirit of the southerner, genial, buoyant, modest, sensitive, one who does not delve into life's riddles, who has no conception of the tidal extent of life or reflects all its isolated phenomena. Here I cannot refrain from a comparison of Shakespeare and Cervantes, or at least from emphasizing those aspects wherein they differ and wherein they agree. How can one draw a comparison? Someone may demand. Shakespeare, a colossus, a demigod. True enough. But neither is Cervantes a midget beside the Titan who created King Lear. He is no dwarf, but a normal man, full-grown man, and a man is privileged to stand upright, and a man should stand upright even in the presence of a demigod. There can be no doubt that Shakespeare, endowed with an opulent and puissant imagination, with the radiance of a masterful poetic gift, and an incomparable intellect, is a giant besides Cervantes. But I believe that Cervantes could stand upright behind him, beside him. But mark this, you will not find in Cervantes' novel any labored humor or simulated illustrations or affected dialogue. Neither will you encounter in his works the beheadings, the plucked out eyes, the rivers of gore, the deliberately stilled atrocities which were the savage inheritance of the Middle Ages, the barbarism that only gradually retreated from the rigid northern nature. And it should be borne in mind that Cervantes, like Shakespeare, lived at the time of St. Bartholomew's Eve, that even for many years thereafter heretics continued to be burned at the stake, while the flow of blood persisted. The Middle Ages are depicted in Don Quixote in the guise of provincial poetry, and through the winsome portraiture of those romances which Cervantes so gaily ridiculed, and to which he later on added more. He continues to mention his works. Right. Shakespeare takes his design from everything in heaven and earth. Nothing is denied him. Nothing escapes his penetrating gaze. He plucks up his subject matter with an invincible commanding sweep of an eagle pouncing upon its prey. Cervantes, on the other hand, presents his character to the reader tenderly, quietly, as a father would his children. He garners only from what is near him. That is where he gets it all. That is also where he is at home. Before the invincible spirit of the English poet, everything that is human seems to yield. Whereas the wealth of Cervantes is derived solely from his own heart. A heart that is warm, genial, and rich with experience. But even that experience has not made it callous. Not in vain was Cervantes imprisoned for 7 long years, since during that time, as he himself relates, he acquired the discipline of patience. The range of his mastery is narrower than Shakespeare's. But within that range is reflected all that is common to human nature. Cervantes does not dazzle with lightning idioms. He does not stun with the fervor of his zeal. His poetry is in no way akin to Shakespeare's, which is at times a turbulent sea, but is rather a deep flowing tranquility through scenes, and the reader, drawn in and encompassed by its translucent waters, willingly drifts with the current, enjoying its truly epic charm. The imagination sees a further symbolism in that these two contemporaneous poets died on precisely the same day, April the 26th, 1616. Cervantes was probably unaware that a Shakespeare had existed. But during the last 3 years of his life, the tragedian may well have read the far-famed novel, which by then existed in an English version, in the seclusion of his Stratford abode. It would be a scene worthy of the brush of an artist-philosopher, Shakespeare reading Don Quixote. Blessed are those countries that give us such men, teachers of their fellow men and of generations to follow. For the unfading laurels that crown the memory of the man of genius likewise adorn the land of their birth. In conclusion, permit me to supplement this brief essay with a few scattered observations. An English lord, a connoisseur in such matters, once in my presence referred to Don Quixote as the perfect gentleman. And indeed he may well be called that. If simplicity and unobtrusive behavior are the criterion of a gentleman, then Don Quixote well deserves the title. He is an authentic hidalgo, and the hidalgos were lower, very low aristocracy, but that had come to be kind of bankrupt, something like that. But in the past, their families had been something. He is an authentic hidalgo, and he remains so even when the fun-loving servants of the prince lather up his face overmuch. The simplicity of his deportment is due to his selflessness, as I might best phrase it, and not to self-glorification. Don Quixote is not forever preoccupied, and since he respects himself as well as others, it never enters his mind to behave in a supercilious manner. But Hamlet, for all his courtly etiquette, appears to have, if you'll pardon the French expression, and yet the airs de parvenu. He's a show-off and a mocker. To compensate for this flaw, he is endowed with an original vigor of expression, such as only a reflective and dynamic personality can boast, and which in a Don Quixote is something altogether inadmissible. The depth and astuteness of Hamlet's power of analysis, together with his versatile schooling, one must not forget that he studied at the University of Wittenberg, have produced in him an exceptional taste. He is a good critic. His counsel to the actors is surprisingly apt and discreet. His aesthetic sense is as conspicuous in him as is the sense of duty in Don Quixote. Don Quixote honors all established institutions, religions, monarchs and princes, at the same time feeling free himself and respecting the freedom of others. Hamlet, on the contrary, reprimands kings and courtiers, but is himself bigoted and tyrannical. Don Quixote is almost illiterate. Hamlet is in all probability, keeps a diary. Though unlearned as Don Quixote is, he has settled opinion about government affairs and public administration. Hamlet cannot spare the time, nor does he wish to dabble in such things. Cervantes has been severely criticized for having buffeted Don Quixote with so many blows. I have already noted that in the second part of the novel he is hardly belaboured at all. Now I wish to add that without such drubbings overdone, the children who, as it is, swallow all the descriptions of his journeys would not take to him so readily, and even for us adults, were he to escape all the pummelings, he would not emerge in his true perspective, but would seem, if he's not beaten up all the time, he would seem cold and remote, no sense. And that would run counter to his nature. So Cervantes knew what he was doing when he's always letting them get pummeled. I have just repeated that in the second part he is no longer physically persecuted, except that toward the end of the novel, after Don Quixote's complete defeat, and is one defeat after another, defeat at the hands of the Knight of the White Moon, defeat after the masked student who beat him up, after relinquishing of his knighthood, and just before his death, a drove of swine charge and trample him. After he had lost everything, been defeated, just before he died, the ultimate joke, huh? A drove of swine charge and trample him. I once heard Cervantes rebuked for his rehashing of the old witticisms of the first part, but one must remember that here too the poet was governed by the instinct of genius. This sordid episode holds a deep significance. The Don Quixotes of the world always have to go through with being trampled by swine, and it must happen, therefore, in their last days. This is the final ransom they pay to fate, to human apathy and misunderstanding. This is the slap dealt by the Pharisee at the end. And then they're ready to die. They have come through the fires of purgatory already on this earth. And so then they have achieved immortality that now hopefully will open its portals to receive them. Hamlet is sometimes ruthless. Recall the fate he prepares for the two courtiers that the king has dispatched to England. Read his oration on Polonius, whom he himself has assassinated. To us, this is an additional reflection of the Middle Ages, which have only recently receded from our view. Then again, we are obliged to see in Don Quixote also an inclination to half-conscious self-delusion. an inclination always conforming to the enthusiast's imagination. His description of what he witnessed in the cave of Montesinos was patently contrived by himself, and did not at all mislead the astute plebeian Sancho Panza. Furthermore, Hamlet grumbles in discouragement over trifles whenever he is thwarted, while Don Quixote, beaten by galley slaves until he is hardly able to move, is not deterred in his hope of ultimate triumph. It's a funny, because he writes in a the language is very, very colloquial, with turns and phrases of, the ordinary folk. There is one, I think this is what he's referring to. They have been beaten to a pulp. Both of them are on the floor. The others have gone. They are there. And finally, Sancho says to him, after a while, they couldn't even speak. They were so beaten up. And finally, Sancho says, Your Excellency, sir, how long do you think before I can move a foot? A foot. Anyway, but here you have it in I lost where I was. Yeah, the galley, by galley slaves. Yeah, he knew all about that. Until he is hardly able to move, he is not deterred in his hope of ultimate triumph. A story of a similar vein has it that for years Fourier went daily in expectation of meeting a certain Englishman with whom he was pleading through the newspapers to give him 1,000,000 francs in support of his plans, and who, as can be easily surmised, never appeared. This is absurd, of course, but it occurs to me that ancient peoples commonly believe their gods to be jealous, to be always demanding something, and that during reverses they were wont to make amends, the people, by voluntary sacrifices, such as Polycrates flinging the ring into the sea. The gods demand sacrifices when we humans do something wrong. Therefore, might we not infer that what appears farcical in the actions and character of those bent on performing a single service to mankind, is their service to mankind is but a tribute offered to placate the angered gods. Without this mirth-provoking, eccentric vanguard, progress would be unthinkable, and the reflective Hamlets would have nothing to philosophize about. To repeat, the Don Quixotes of this world invent, the Hamlets exploit what they have invented. Someone may ask, how can the Hamlets exploit anything when they doubt everything and believe no one? My reply is that nature administers our earth so adroitly as to permit neither thoroughgoing Hamlets nor full-fledged Don Quixotes. These are simply extreme expressions of the two opposite tendencies. Life steers toward one or the other of these extremes, but never reaches either of them. It is well to remember that just as the principle of analysis, of scrutinizing and probing into everything is extended in Hamlet to the limit of tragedy, So in Don Quixote, enthusiasm is stampeded to the opposite order of comedy. In reality, one seldom meets with either unalloyed comedy or utter tragedy. We esteem Hamlet a good deal more because of Horatius' devotion to him. The latter type of personality is frequently encountered in our midst and enhances our prestige. In Horatio, we have the type of the adherent, the disciple in the supreme sense of the word. He has a resolute and undeviating character, a quick heart, and rather limited logic. He is conscious of all his imperfections and therefore unassuming, a rare occurrence in people of this category. He thirsts for knowledge, is eager to learn, and therefore idolizes the astute Hamlet. He becomes devoted to him, heart and soul, without asking anything in return. He submits to the dictates of Hamlet, not as to those of a prince, but rather as to those of a far-sighted chieftain. One of the momentous services that the Hamlets render can be ascribed to their contribution toward the maturity of such individuals as Horatio, who welcomed the need of meditation, nurturing it in their glorious hearts and disseminating it throughout the world. The words in which Hamlet honors Horatius' sterling worth add dignity to himself. In them, he sets forth an exalted concept of man, of his high possibilities, which no skeptical animus can shake. Excuse me. He addresses Horatio. Since my dear soul was mistress of her choice, and could of men distinguish, her election hath still thee for herself. For thou hast been as one, in suffering all, that suffers nothing. A man that fortunes buffets and rewards has taken with equal thanks. And blessed are those whose blood and judgment are so well commingled that they are not a pipe for fortune's finger to sound what stop she please. Give me that man that is not passion's slave, and I will wear him in my heart's core, I in my heart of hearts, as I do thee. The upright skeptic invariably respects the staunch believer, the Stoic. When the ancient world disintegrated, and thus in every comparable epoch, people of the highest rank took refuge in Stoicism as the only means of sustaining human dignity in a time of crisis. The skeptics, who were impotent to face death, to embark for the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, they reverted to Epicureanism. Pleasure. This phenomenon is as pathetic as it is well known. But Hamlet and Don Quixote end their lives in a moving way. Still, what a contrast, even in this finale. Hamlet's last words are impressive. He grows quiet, resigns himself to fate, bids Horatio farewell, and declares from his deathbed, in favor of the young prince Fortinbras, the heir apparent who has not desecrated his right to succession. But his gaze is no longer directed ahead. The rest is silence, says the expiring skeptic, as he is about to be hushed forever. The rest is silence. Don Quixote's death inspires one's soul with a certain terseness. Right then and there, everyone recognizes and fully esteems this character. When by way of consolation Don Quixote's former footman speaks of their intended journey, what happens is that Sancho is there. Don Quixote is dying on his bed. Sancho is kneeling down, weeping, and he's trying to give him courage. You hold on, Your Excellency, sir. We have many adventures before us yet. We are going to go into another adventure, and we are going to do this. And he's doing the best he can, Sancho. And what does Don Quixote say? No, Sancho, I am not Don Quixote, a knight errant. I'm only old Alonso here. Though I was called Alonso the Good once. I ask you forgiveness, Sancho. I ask everyone's forgiveness. Those were his last words. So, this great Russian writer, Turgenev, says at the end, and he concludes, there is nothing to add. Oh, he says, but good deeds shall not dissipate in smoke. They are more enduring than the most radiant beauty. All things shall pass, saith the apostle. Love alone shall abide. There is nothing to add. I shall consider myself fortunate if by an indication of the two fundamental directions of the human spirit, which I have spoken of before you, I have aroused certain thoughts within you, thoughts which perhaps may not agree with mine. I shall deem myself fortunate if I have, even approximately, fulfilled the task I have set myself, and have not wearied your kind attention. And he ends the talk in this way, and I also finish my video. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.